Welcome to the War Academy channel. Today we have a very special program, in which we are going to end one of the biggest military hoaxes of the Second World War, this being the real reason for the German cancellation of the Kursk offensive and its consequent failure in this battle. As you all know, this great German attack was launched on the Eastern Front on July 5, 1943, and was called Operation Citadel. In it, the Germans intended a series of objectives that they could not finally achieve. These were the following. In the first place, they wanted to carry out a great encirclement of Soviet troops similar to the many they had done during their previous campaigns, something that finally they could not repeat in Kursk. Secondly, they wanted to cut the front line considerably, in order to generate more reserves in the rear that would allow them a better defense. This was also not achieved. Another objective pursued by this offensive was to strike a blow on the table, which would make both Germany's allies and its enemies see that the war was by no means lost and that they could continue to trust the victory over the Soviet Union. Again, the result offered just the opposite thought. As a fourth point, and no less important, the Germans wanted to capture a large number of prisoners to send them to their factories, since they had a shortage of workers. While they hoped to capture hundreds of thousands of men to feed their war industry, which was at peak production, they ultimately managed to capture only about 40,000 Soviets. As the fifth and last objective to achieve with the victory in Kursk, we have that with the destruction of large Soviet forces, a prolonged pause in the fighting was expected, totally needed on the Eastern Front, which would allow them to take oxygen and recover. With this in addition, it was intended to regain the initiative when attacking. As we have seen, if all these objectives had been achieved, Germany would have emerged greatly strengthened this summer of 1943, however, quite the opposite happened. And it is that although Hitler himself had sent a message to his soldiers in which he told them that this was going to be the decisive battle, and that everything depended on it, when a few weeks later, far from advancing and conquering the objective, the German army was in heavy defensive fighting and even in retreat, this caused a great impact both in the army and in the population. For the first time, the Gestapo itself produced a report indicating that morale among the population had fallen a lot, due to the defeatism brought by the soldiers who returned home during some leave. It was from then on that the threat of the Soviet armies entering German territory began to be more and more present among the population. Making a small subsection here, we have to point out that the Soviet intention behind these counteroffensives that they launched during that summer were not simply to conquer the Ural salient or the Donets basin, but they were the total collapse of the German army and the advance until the very borders of the Reich. This they would achieve a year later. Having explained the objectives of both sides during this summer, and the final consequences of the battle, let's now see the reason for its cancellation. As you know, this offensive consisted of two pincers that would be launched from the north and south with the aim of meeting at Kursk. These attacks are launched on July 5th, and to everyone's surprise, in the northern pincer the advance has to be stopped a few days later, mainly due to the attacks that the Soviets began to launch on the Ural salient on the 12th of July. However, and despite this attack from the rear, the offensive in the northern pincer had already lost its momentum for days, and the expected rate of advance had been breached by far. In the southern pincer by that day, somewhat greater penetration had been achieved, but once again, it was clear that the Germans had failed to take the Soviets by surprise. In addition, they had also missed the goal of making a rapid advance, which would lead to a large encirclement of enemy troops. In any event, with the northern pincer stalled, it was clear that Manstein's troops in the south were not going to be able to complete the full maneuver required. A day later, for July 13th, Hitler called an emergency meeting attended by both Manstein, who was the commander of the Southern Army Group, and Kluge, who commanded those of the Central Sector. In it, the German leader wanted to announce to his marshals that the Citadel operation was going to be cancelled, alluding as the reason for the Allied landing in Sicily that had taken place on July 9th, and the need to now divert troops there. Due to this reason, Hitler told them that he had to cancel the offensive, since those divisions were needed from the Eastern Front in the Mediterranean. This conversation was reproduced in Manstein's memoirs, and has been responsible for the focus of attention that has always been placed on this reason by many later historians. But, although it is true that Manstein was not lying, and that was what he had been told, this was not the real reason. Later studies have revealed that Hitler told Manstein not to argue, and that Manstein be forced to obey orders without opposition. This can be verified in that it was not until July 24, when Mussolini was deposed, that the Leibstandarte division began to be sent to Italy. This came almost 2 weeks after that meeting where the operation was called off, and was the only division to be withdrawn from the Eastern Front in this sector. So why was this operation actually called off, and why did Hitler make that excuse to Manstein? If there was one thing that worried Hitler, it was losing the Donetsk Basin, due to its economic value. He knew that if he told Manstein that he was going to cancel the offensive, because he was worried about these attacks, which the Soviets had begun to launch on the Urel salient, and the future ones they foresaw in the Donetsk Basin, Manstein would discuss the decision with him. However, if he alluded to what was happening in Sicily, he would no longer have any knowledge or control over them, to object. Kluge communicated at that meeting that the Ninth Army was no longer going to make any advances towards Kursk and that it was completely focused on trying to stop the Soviet offensives in its rear. This left the southern pincer alone in its advance, but Manstein insisted that the offensive was at its decisive moment, and that after the tremendous casualties they had inflicted on the Soviets, they had to be on the verge of collapse. When told about the movement of Soviet troops that had been detected in the Donetsk, Manstein said that it was a risk that had to be taken and that the best way to combat it was to continue attacking in the direction of Kursk, to take the initiative and provoke that the Soviets had to reinforce the area and occupy their troops there. However, he recognized that if the Soviets launched strong offensives in the Donetsk Basin, these attacks on the Kursk salient would have to be called off. Finally, Manstein managed to get permission to continue making minor attacks on the southern pincer, without having to withdraw troops. Always that if, being aware of any Soviet movement in the Donetsk Basin. From July 13 to 16, Manstein's troops continued their actions near the city of Prokhorovka, but after that brutal combat, in which they finished seeing the tenacity of the Soviet forces in the area, and the alerts they were receiving in the Donetsk area, they finally had to put an end to their operation, and start preparing for the onslaught of the Red Army. It was on the 17th of July that the Soviet offensives began in the Donetsk Basin, and that a series of defensive battles by the Germans now began to rage across the southern and central fronts. Seeing this, and so that it is still more clearly understood, we can summarize it in the following. Having failed to make this rapid advance, which would have achieved a major encirclement at Kursk, the Germans were left considerably bogged down with their forces pinned inside the salient, while the Soviets now began to launch their offensives into the various German rear areas. In order to respond to these attacks, and hold said sectors, the troops of these pincers were needed, and they had to be moved towards the Soviet breakout points. This was generally what caused the final cancellation of this operation, more than the Allied landing in Sicily, although this does not mean that it was not important. Well, that's the end of this program, with which we hope to have broken a hoax about this battle that was much larger than is usually explained, since it was far from just those first days of the German offensive. We leave you in the description a program analyzing how was the meeting prior to the launch of the Citadel operation. Leave us in the comments how, according to your opinion, this battle could have had a different result. We say goodbye here. Many thanks to everyone, especially the sponsors who make this possible. Subscribe and share this program if you liked it, and see you in the next one. See you soon.